clear about dystopian societies, whether we read about them in books or whether we see them in films, is that there are slow changes that deceive a society that this was always the way, but there's always a growing resistance against that change. And the one thing about the growing resistance in the UK at the moment is I do think that we're growing, but we're also having our own resistance demonised by those small changes. The fact that the right to protest has been demonised, the fact that people almost talk about going on a protest almost as an illegal action, the fact that you can get kettled and people don't see the fact that this is actually an infringement on our democratic rights, the fact that a mayor of London can buy water cannons and think this is a legitimate thing for him to do is part of his role as a politician, even though he actually never used them and they did get sold back. But, I mean, the choices of Boris Johnson are probably a whole other discussion that we could have. But at the moment, I think that we can be clear that we are victims of divide and rule politics. When the failures of government policy are being blamed on migrants, being blamed on the EU even. I always joke that the EU is like the Andy Murray of politics. We all know that Andy Murray is British when he's winning Wimbledon and Scottish when he's losing. And it's a bit like that with EU regulation. It's with EU policy. If it's good policy, we'll say it's British policy. And if it's bad policy, we'll blame it on the EU. We can keep blaming our failures on the EU, whether that's the closures and loss of jobs, whether that's the loss of jobs at Port Talbot, or whether that's impacts on other parts of our society. We use these scapegoats of that failure of government policy. And for too long have we been allowed that to happen. And with Brexit, what's going to happen now? Now that we can't blame the EU, and we're left with only one group to blame failures on, it only took a few moments for that change to happen. My friend who lives in Cardiff at 6:30 in the morning, a Welsh Muslim woman, wrote her despair at the result of the EU referendum. At 6:32, she had a tweet back saying, "Go home." At 6:35, she sent a tweet out saying, "I'm a Welsh woman, I am home." At 6:40, she got a tweet from somebody entirely different saying, "A pig may be born in a barn, that doesn't make it a horse." And we have seen that change grow. We know that that divide and rule is building in our society. We know that racism is on the increase and that we're blaming the failures of our society on migrants. We're blaming them on different ethnicities, and we're blaming them even on the poorest, the most vulnerable. We need to be standing up. I'm really proud that being part of the Green Party, representing the Green Party, that we always have, and we always will stand up for migrants. And this was more clear to me than ever before during the immoral and horrendous impact of Byron Burgers when they took their employees to a health and safety training and then arrested 35 of them and deported 25 of them. I was the only politician to actually stand against that. And we need to be making sure that we have that. We need to be making sure that we are standing up for migrants, because as we scratch the surface of our country, we have seen what oozes out as being horrendously racist. What we're seeing at the moment is that beginning of something darker. Because we all feel it right now. We all feel that we're on the cusp of change. And that can be a change for hope, or it can be a change of fear. And as we're seeing the rise of Trump, and as we're seeing the fear in our society that is dividing us more and more than I've seen before, then we need to be making sure that we fight for hope. Because I've been in politics, maybe for a lot less than a lot of you have. I've been involved in politics for 10 years now. Actually longer than that, but brilliant. It feels like since this Conservative government came into power that we've always been fighting against something. We've always been fighting against the cuts. We've always been fighting against the rise of tuition fees. We've always been fighting against their changes. And this is, in a post-Brexit society, even though I am due, as someone who set up two pro-EU campaigns, that basically wanted to represent workers' rights, human rights, environmental protection that the EU lets us have. Now that in the post-Brexit society, we now need to fight for hope. We now need to fight for those rights. And we can fight for something different. We've seen our very constitution challenged. We've had people challenging unelected people in the European Parliament. Now let's change that and talk about unelected people in the House of Lords. Let's change that and talk about the failures in our democracy, whether that's from the need for proportional representation or the need for an elected second house. Whether that's the need for more localised forms of governance that creates a more human form of politics. Maybe that's even the need for media reform. One thing that was clear to me during the EU referendum was the ability for our media to hoodwink us, the ability of our media to peddle the lies that people say. I actually thought it was interesting that Boris Johnson went to Cornwall and leant out of his bus with an incorrect statistic about how much the EU costs a day and waved Cornish pasties out of the window. It was actually Molly Scott Cato that said, "Beware, this week beware Etonians branding baked goods," and highlighted the fact that in Cornwall, the Cornish pasty is actually protected by EU law, and the media criticising his stance on that media stunt that he pulled. We have a lot to challenge on the media. We have a lot to challenge to make sure that we get the correct, that we get statistics and diversity of thought represented in our society. But we also, from here on in, we need to be fighting for that message of hope. We need to be fighting to make sure that we speak out for the most vulnerable, represent migrants, represent people that are being victimised by the austerity agenda, and make sure that we are fighting becoming increasingly dystopian, because there are two people who win in dystopian societies: the resistance or the status quo. So let's build the resistance.
Yeah!